Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be taking a look at how the Constitution was created. It's almost like, jumping into a time machine. Back to that hot Philadelphia summer in 1787, you can almost picture it. The room, packed with those passionate founding fathers, the powdered wigs and all, and they're all working on this incredibly important task to create something that would shape a nation.
Yeah, it's so easy to think of the Constitution like as some kind of legendary document, but what we often forget is that there were actual people behind it, real people with their own, personalities and goals and fears.
We're talking about a time when the United States, so young then, was really on the verge of falling apart. Its first government, those Articles of Confederation, they were like, well, a really old wagon that was just about ready to completely fall apart.
They gave so much power to each individual state, it made it almost impossible to govern the entire country. Trade was a mess. Congress couldn't even enforce its own laws. It felt like the whole thing could just collapse at any moment.
Right. And then there's Shays' Rebellion. When thousands of farmers, struggling with all that debt, decided to take a stand against the government in Massachusetts, it was a huge wake-up call, like saying, look, either you build a stronger government for the whole nation or watch everything crumble.
Oh, absolutely. Shays' Rebellion wasn't just some local event. It had a huge impact on the whole country. I mean, it showed everyone just how fragile this new nation was. And it even made the founding fathers, who were, the most skeptical, rethink if maybe a more unified government was needed.
Yeah. Now, you'd think everyone would be totally on board with this idea of a strong national government. But some, like Patrick Henry, remember him, the famous speaker from the Revolution, he thought it was a dangerous move, like it was going to lead to tyranny.
Henry and others who were called anti-federalists, well, they fought so hard to get away from a powerful king. They weren't about to let some new central power take away the freedoms they had just won.
So the big question was, how do you create unity and stability, but still make sure everyone's individual freedoms are protected? It's like walking a tightrope, isn't it? That challenge, finding that balance, that's at the heart of the Constitution.
Oh, it absolutely is. And that whole struggle played out in a big way during the Constitutional Convention. Can you imagine walking into that room? You've got George Washington, this towering figure from the Revolution leading all the discussions. James Madison, who practically designed the Constitution. He's busy writing everything down. Then you have big personalities like Benjamin Franklin and John Adams, each with their own strong opinions and pretty sharp wit, too.
It must have been like a political drama unfolding right there. You have the Federalists, led by Hamilton, wanting a strong central government. Then you have the Anti-Federalists, like Jefferson, fiercely defending the rights of individual states.
And we can't forget the ideas of the Enlightenment that were floating around at that time. These guys weren't just making things up as they went along. Thinkers like Montesquieu, with his ideas about separating powers, and John Locke, who emphasized natural rights, they all had a huge influence on the founding fathers.
So they weren't just figuring out, the nuts and bolts of government. They were wrestling with really big questions, like, what is human nature? What's the purpose of government? What does freedom really mean? But how do you take those big ideas and turn them into an actual plan for running a country?
Right. Well, it definitely wasn't easy. Take the Virginia Plan, for instance. That was Madison's idea. He wanted a legislature with two parts and representation based on, how many people lived in each state. Obviously, this made the bigger states happy, but the smaller ones, not so much. They were worried about being completely overshadowed.
That sounds like it could have been a recipe for gridlock.
Oh, it was, which is where the New Jersey Plan came in. It was championed by William Patterson, and he argued that every state, no matter how big or small, should have the same representation. It was all about keeping the smaller states in the game. You can almost hear those debates happening, all the impassioned speeches, the compromises made under pressure.
Like some high-stakes poker game. But the fate of a whole nation is on the line.
And then something amazing happened. They managed to agree on a compromise. It was a game changer, really, and it shaped the future of America. We call it the Connecticut Compromise, or sometimes the Great Compromise.
This is where things get interesting. They decided on two parts for the legislature. First, the Senate, where each state gets the same number of representatives, and then the House of Representatives, where the number of reps depends on the population. It was a clever solution. A way to balance things out and make everyone reasonably happy.
But even with that big agreement out of the way, there were still some big hurdles left. One of the biggest and probably the most controversial was slavery.
Ah, the elephant in the room, right. Even though you won't find the word slavery in the Constitution, it cast a huge shadow over everything. How could a country that claimed to be all about freedom and equality turn a blind eye to something as brutal as slavery?
It was a question that really tested the whole foundation of the convention. Some delegates, like Gouverneur Morris from Pennsylvania, they called slavery out for what it was, a truly awful institution. But others, especially the ones from the South, argued that their economy completely depended on slave labor. They thought that getting rid of it would ruin them.
So they were stuck at a crossroads. Would they face this moral issue head on? Or would they put unity and compromise first, even if it meant letting this injustice continue?
The decision they made, the Three-Fifths Compromise, well, it shows just how complicated and contradictory things were back then. They decided that for representation and taxes, each enslaved person would count as three-fifths of a person.
It was a compromise, but a deeply flawed one, a concession to the political realities of the time. But it also set the stage for a lot of trouble down the road, because that question of slavery, it didn't go away. It would come back to haunt the nation, and eventually it led to the Civil War.
It's crazy to think about it. Just a group of guys stuck in a hot room coming up with this document that would change a whole country forever. But the story of the Constitution, it doesn't start when they sign it. That's when the real fight started.
Yeah, the ink wasn't even dry, and people were already arguing about whether to approve it. It wasn't a sure thing at all. Each state had to have its own meeting to decide, yay or nay on this whole new government thing.
And we're not talking some polite little debate here. This was a full-on political brawl, right? Newspapers, pamphlets, speeches everywhere. The whole country was involved. Think about how different things were then. News traveled so slow, people really depended on what they read to figure out what to think. So newspapers, that's where this whole battle played out. Federalists versus anti-federalists, all trying to convince people to side with them.
I guess it was kind of like social media, but with really long, angry posts.
Oh, yeah, exactly. It was a time when people really, really cared about these issues, and they weren't afraid to fight for what they believed in. You had people like Mercy Otis Warren. She was writing under a fake name, a Colombian patriot, and she was totally against the Constitution. She thought it was a threat to individual liberty. And then you had Madison, Hamilton, and Jay writing those famous Federalist Papers. Those were like a whole series of essays explaining why the Constitution was a good idea and why people should vote for it.
And the Federalist Papers weren't just some boring legal documents. They were actually pretty clever and persuasive. They really understood how to appeal to people's emotions.
They did. They went straight to the heart of people's fears and worries. What if the government becomes too powerful? What about the balance between the states and the federal government? They tackled all those tough questions.
So while some folks were worried that the Constitution would give the government too much power, the Federalists were saying, hey, look, a strong national government is exactly what we need to be successful and to make sure everyone's rights are protected.
Right. And you know what? It worked. The Federalist Papers and a lot of campaigning by Washington and Hamilton convinced enough people the Constitution was ratified.
But it wasn't a slam dunk, was it? The anti-Federalists, even though they lost that fight, well, they made a big impact. They were so worried about the government getting too powerful that they actually made sure we got something really important, the Bill of Rights.
Yep. The Bill of Rights, those first 10 amendments, those weren't just an afterthought. The Federalists had to agree to include them to get some of those folks who were worried about individual liberty on board.
Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, right to bear arms, protection from unreasonable searches. Those basic rights, we almost take them for granted now. But we have them because the anti-Federalists fought for them.
They were smart. They knew that even a government that's supposed to protect freedom, it could easily turn around and become oppressive if there aren't any checks and balances. The Bill of Rights, it's like a reminder to always be on guard and to fight for our freedoms.
Okay, so we've got the Constitution, we've got the Bill of Rights, we've got a new government.
Yeah.
But what happened next? How did this whole experiment actually play out?
That's where things get even more interesting. Those first few decades of the U.S., man, that was a wild ride. Full of energy, but also lots of ups and downs. You've got George Washington. He wasn't exactly thrilled to be president, but he knew he had to do it. And he ended up setting a lot of precedents that presidents still follow today.
It's hard to imagine the pressure he must have felt. Every single thing he did was going to be an example for future presidents. No pressure, right?
He handled it all so well. He just understood how to be a leader. He knew how to be strong, but also humble, to encourage unity, but also respect different opinions. He created this atmosphere of, dignity and respect for the law. It made the new government feel much more legitimate.
And he picked some really smart people for his cabinet,
Right.
even if they didn't always get along.
Yeah.
Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State and Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury. Talk about a power team. Or maybe more like a clash of the titans.
Oh, it was definitely both. Those two, they were brilliant, but they also fought a lot. The National Bank had to interpret the Constitution. They disagreed on just about everything. I bet those arguments were legendary.
Yeah, it's kind of like watching a political reality show, but way more important.
Exactly. Those fights show just how much debate there was about what kind of country America should be. A powerful nation focused on business and industry, or a country of independent farmers with small-town values. It was a big question.
And, those same arguments about the role of government, the balance of power, and what freedom really means, we're still having those debates today.
You're right. The Founding Fathers didn't give us all the answers. They gave us a framework, a set of values, and a plan for governing ourselves. It's our job to keep thinking about those things, to see how they apply to the challenges we face today, and to make sure this whole democracy thing keeps working.
It's like they built those debates into the system.
Right.
They knew a healthy democracy needs disagreement. It needs that back and forth of different ideas.
Totally. And they also knew that the Constitution, even though it's an amazing document, it wasn't perfect. There were some big questions they left unanswered. Questions that future generations would have to figure out.
Like, how exactly do we interpret the Constitution? Do we stick to exactly what the Founding Fathers meant? Or can we change our understanding of it to fit the world today?
$1,000,000 question right there. And there's no easy answer. But the important thing is that we keep talking about it, we keep having these conversations, respectfully, of course. That's how we honor what the Founding Fathers did and keep the spirit of the Constitution alive.
I mean, it's pretty mind-blowing, right? This document, written so long ago in a world that was so different, and it still matters today. The Constitution isn't just some old piece of paper. It shows just how powerful ideas can be and how important it is to keep fighting for freedom.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. And think about it. The Constitution has been there for some of the biggest changes in American history. Like, remember Marbury v. Madison? That Supreme Court case. It set up this idea of judicial review. So the court can say if a law goes against the Constitution, that one decision based on the Constitution changed how power works in our government.
Oh, for sure. And we can't forget the fight for civil rights. The Constitution talks about equality, and that became this rallying cry for people who wanted to end segregation and make sure all Americans had the same rights.
Right, and it shows you how strong the Constitution is. It can bring people together, but it can also push for change. Even someone like Thomas Jefferson, who really respected the Constitution, he knew it wasn't perfect. He thought each generation should be able to look at it again, maybe make some changes to make sure it still works for them.
Yeah, he made this comparison, like the Constitution is like a ship. You got to keep fixing it up so it can stay afloat. It's a good way to think about it, right?
Yeah.
The Constitution, it has to change with the times. It can't just stay frozen in time.
And sometimes those changes are hard. Look at the Civil War. That was a terrible, terrible fight that almost ripped the country apart. And at the heart of it was this debate about what the Constitution really meant. And, could a country that said it was all about liberty and equality also allow slavery?
It makes you think, right? Progress doesn't always happen in a straight line. The Constitution has been this source of inspiration, but also division. It shows our best hopes, but also some of our worst mistakes.
But even when things were really bad, like during the Civil War, when it felt like the country was falling apart, the Constitution was still there. It gave us a way to work through disagreements, to handle all that anger and frustration, and to eventually come back together as a country.
It's kind of amazing when you think about it. So much of what we have today, our freedoms, our rights, how our government works, it all goes back to this document created by a group of men who had this vision for a new kind of nation.
And that's what makes the Founding Fathers so impressive. They were smart enough to create a system that was both strong and flexible. I mean, they couldn't predict all the problems we'd face, but they gave us a way to handle those problems and make our own future.
And that's a good reminder for us, isn't it? The Constitution, it's not just the government's job to protect it. It's all of our responsibility. It's part of our history. And we're all part of this conversation about what it means, a conversation that keeps going generation after generation.
If you're really interested in all this, you should check out the book, How the Constitution Was Created. It really takes you back to that time. You get to meet those people, hear those debates, and see how all those compromises came together.
It reminds you that history isn't just dates and names. It's about people and their stories and their struggles. And when we understand our past, it helps us appreciate what we have now and make better choices for the future.
So go grab a copy of How the Constitution Was Created. And hey, join us next time on the deep dive as we, take a deep dive into another piece of history. Until then, keep those minds curious.